Legitimate territory for religion. Paul Collins.
Yes and no, Geraldine. Yes, in the sense that climate change, at least from, I think, the Pope's perspective, a moral issue. So therefore, religion can comment on it. But no, it is not the Church's job to decide on science. They made a fool of themselves back in the time of Galileo. So it's probably best that they don't stray into that area, but simply accept what the scientists say.
Peter Curti, how do you see it?
Well, I certainly think that religion has something to say about the environment and the earth on which we live. But I do think that climate change has become an alarmist ideology, and the Church and religion in general probably ought to steer clear.
Eleni?
I think climate change poses some profoundly existential issues for us, questions about who we are, how we manage ourselves and relate to each other, and about our relationship with the environment. So, yes, I think fundamentally religious, yes.
Paul?
I think it's perfectly understandable and desirable that the Pope would pronounce on climate change. And I'm certain what he said will be very popular in many quarters. I think, however, that this is a complex moral issue and there are many traps for the Church involved in this.
OK, so a good variety of views there, which we'll take up in our discussion. Let's have a brief look at how religion has traditionally viewed the natural world and our place in it.
From earliest times, the natural world has defined human spirituality and worship. Ancient civilizations had a close affinity with the land and all living things. The idea that God created the world for people to exploit comes from the Judeo-Christian scriptures.
Then God said, "Let us make man in our image, after our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the air, over the cattle, and over all the earth."
But it was the Industrial Revolution of the 18th century that profoundly shifted people's relationship to the natural world. Industrialisation has brought enormous economic benefits and lifted millions out of poverty. But in the last 40 years, many religious leaders have pointed to the impact of unchecked industrial growth on the environment and the world's poor. Since the 1970s, the World Council of Churches, which represents over 500 million Christians, has been calling for sustainable development. In 2006, Australia's religious leaders called on the federal government to make climate change their top priority.
It's a rare sight and a rare unity. 16 religious denominations joining hands campaigning for action on climate change.
In May this year, the Church of England withdrew investments from polluting fossil fuels in what it called its moral responsibility to protect the world's poor from the impact of global warming. Last month, Pope Francis, who leads the world's 1.2 billion Catholics, released his much-anticipated encyclical letter about the environment called Laudato Si. Addressed to every person on the planet, Pope Francis calls on us to care for our common home and blames selfishness and greed for global warming.
Now, Paul Collins, is this encyclical in the tradition of encyclicals and Catholic social teaching? As an historian of the Church, how would you answer?
Well, it's certainly in the tradition of Catholic social teaching. It looks at issues like biodiversity, it looks at issues like global warming, it looks at issues like technology. That's one that absolutely astonished me, yes, that technology got a Guernsey in this encyclical. So what he's doing is he is actually following Vatican II. He's looking at the world, he's seeing what's going on in it, and he's drawing from that, and he's bringing the Church's tradition to bear on that. This is a grand narrative. Now, grand narratives, of course, have got problems at the edges, it seems to me, for sure, and I'm happy to concede.
Now, Paul Kelly, I think it's that grand narrative critique of capitalism that bothers you, or the tone of it.
Well, look, what bothers me about the encyclical is that I think it's very pessimistic. It paints a very, very gloomy picture of the future. It gives a lot of credence to doomsday theories, and I think above all, a lot of it reads as though it is a deep green ideological text. I think also when it comes to the relationship between capitalism and climate change, it is ignorant and ill-informed. It talks about the problems of greed, the financial system, the flaws of capitalism.
Well, in fact, you say that it's a profound intellectual ignorance dressed up as honouring God. That was how you wrote about it.
And that's what I think.
Eleni, I presume you have a different view?
I do have a different view. What I heard in the encyclical was actually a voice that we're not used to hearing much in this country, and that's the voice of the Global South. It's a voice that I've heard when I've been involved in World Council of Churches activities and when I've been with people who live in countries in Latin America and Africa, and certainly in the Pacific. I believe that what the encyclical does, it's a very important thing to do, is that it's bringing all those things together in dialogue. The gospel, the experiences, particularly of those who are poor and marginalised in the world, and the science. And I think there are very good sort of biblical and Christian foundations for having that kind of conversation.
I mean, I wonder, Peter Curti, one of the key arguments in it is if we could only go slower production, slower ways of life. How do you think that is going to be heard in a place like Australia?
I think it can be heard as an anti-growth movement or as a call to halt industrial development. The problem, I think, with the encyclical is that it calls for a halt to the very mechanisms that can lift people out of poverty and help to bring an end to the disease and depredation that afflicts so many people on the planet.
What do you mean?
Well, I think cheap energy is an important resource for people in the developing world, and I think
coal, you mean?
Coal, but other fossil-based fuels, but certainly coal would be one of them. And he calls for a halt to fossil-based mining or fossil fuel mining, and calls for a halt to economies that are based upon fossil fuels, and wants to see a resurgence of renewables. Well, that's not going to be cheap and affordable for people in the developing world.
There's a statement about that we have actually had a couple of centuries of believing we had limitless powers, that the Industrial Revolution had encouraged humans to believe almost they were gods.
Well, that's because there's also a quite serious assault on anthropocentrism.
Define what you mean by that.
Well, by anthropocentrism, I mean that the entire cosmos revolves around the human. What I think he does is he forces us back into a position that is much more humble, into a position whereby we don't think that everything exists for our sake.
Paul?
What concerns me really is when he talks about a new concept of progress, when he talks about ecological conversion, what on earth does this mean? He's very prescriptive and very clear in saying that we need less production, less consumerism. We need, in certain respects, to accept less economic growth. Now, if we look at Australia and if we look at most countries, virtually the entire public policy debate is about growth and distributing the benefits of growth to health, education and welfare. Now, it's extraordinary that we've got the Pope sounding, in a sense, extremely old-fashioned, almost nostalgic and dreaming for a world which goes back to beyond the Industrial Revolution. Now, clearly, that's not what he means, but I think there's a great uncertainty here and there's a contradiction.
You can disagree with that. You can say that the policy positions are flawed. Just take that first issue that you brought up of ecological conversion. I know exactly what he means by ecological conversion. It is when you open your eyes and you see what is actually happening to the natural world. It's when you actually see things in perspective, when you escape from the prison of the kind of world that we live in. I mean, no one would disagree with you that the world you're describing makes sense. Of course it does, because we all live in it. But what I think he is doing is challenging us to look beyond that world, to get above the ruck.
Eleni?
Regardless of the encyclical's shortcomings, what the Pope is inviting us to do is to consider how everything in the world is connected. We can't separate an economy based on unlimited growth from impacts on the environment, from the rights of future generations that will be affected in that. All of this is one together, and I think that's one of the great strengths of the encyclical, that it actually invites us to think holistically. the movement, the goal is towards a reconciliation for the whole creation with God. And I think that's where he starts. And that is a very grand narrative.
I just want to move on to this issue of technology, if I may, because I was really fascinated by how much he was prepared to damn technology as almost a human arrogance and to see it as encouraging humans to believe they were limitless. And really, Paul, I thought he might almost bless the ingenuity of humans to find answers to some of these things, to bless the engineers. He doesn't.
Well, he doesn't. Again, it's a yes and a no, I think, there. I mean, he's not condemning technology. What they mean by technology is the way that it enframes, it contextualises our entire lives. I mean, we've got to remember this encyclical, the person who's mentioned most in this encyclical is St. Francis of Assisi. And that's what Francis is trying to get behind, take Christianity back to its organic contact with nature.
One of the things that surprised me was how personal the encyclical became at some points when he was talking about technology. He didn't use these words, but I got the impression that he was thinking of people that are hyper-connected to their mobile devices.
A super development mentality.
Yes. That's right. And when I read that, I thought about what the Pope was also saying about the great Judeo-Christian traditions of Sabbath and Jubilee, so rest and reconnection with each other and reconnection with the land. But technology is key to answering the challenges and the threats of climate change.
One of the things that disappoints me about the encyclical is that at the end of the day, the Church is still profoundly alienated from the modern world. Mm-hmm. And he's very explicit about this, saying we can't look to economics and technology to solve the problem of climate change. Well, frankly, we are going to look to technology and economics to solve the problem of climate change. That's precisely where we're all looking.
Peter?
As long as it's understood as primarily an encyclical calling individuals to reflect upon how they relate to God, neighbour, earth, how they restore a sense of connection amongst those three things, it can, I think, generate a great deal of renewal and vitality.
It is interesting, though, for instance, the Anglicans, your communion, they did with their big divestment policy that was announced just before the encyclical came out by the Archbishop of Canterbury. It had a different tone, I thought.
I think they are different. I think the Anglican Church in this country is taking a much more pragmatic and policy-based decision to divest from fossil fuels. You either dump the entire holding or you can taper the holding. There isn't really the same sort of language about spirituality, although there is, of course, talk about environmental stewardship, which I think is an important theme. But there isn't the same, I think, sense of call to personal conversion, which the Pope makes in his encyclical.
Yes, and of course, your church, the Uniting Church, ever since it was formed in 1977, has been very strong about climate change.
Yes.
And the language is sort of very confessional, almost we confess that we have done terrible damage.
The Pope's encyclical is reminiscent of the Uniting Church's own statement called An Economy of Life, which we adopted in 2009, which did some similar things. It did not reject economics or technology, but both, I think, are calling us to consider a different way of doing economy. It's one of the great myths of our time, I think, and a very damaging myth, that there's only one way to do capitalist economies. It's clear that there's a market fundamentalism in the global economic agenda that continues to marginalise the poor while prioritising the already wealthy, and I think that's one of the keys in the encyclical to reading it is that it's not about deriding economics. It's about saying there are different ways that we can organise our economy. It's a tool for us, not something that we serve.
But isn't this one of your key objections? That in fact, the implication of going for different sorts of investment is that it deprives the poor, the world's poor at the moment, of access to cheap electricity.
And cheap energy leads to economic growth, and economic growth leads to improved health, reduction in poverty, and on the whole, economies that grow tend to have a declining birth rate.
I've heard other people argue that the technology of solar cells is far cheaper than coal. It is non-polluting,
and it's getting
and
cheaper
it is
all the
able
time.
to be set up.
It is getting cheaper.
It is able to be set up in villages. So this kind of divinising of coal, with respect, I think is a real problem. And he is very condemnatory of coal.
Oh, he is. He absolutely is. But I suppose we've had the cheap electricity and we can't now deny it to the developing world, can we?
No, and that's not what anyone is asking for. And I actually believe that the examination of our conscience would be better spent looking at things like global military spending. It would take 10 days' worth of global military spending to provide clean water for the entire planet. So it's all about priorities. What are the values that sit underneath them? And I think the Pope is very clear about what he believes, that the values that sit underneath this global economic agenda are greed and individualism.
Paul Kelly, I presume this is what gives capitalists, and particularly the ones he'll be visiting in the US when he goes there in September, hysterics when they hear discussions that morph from something like this into Eleni's view about the different priorities.
Well, I think this is correct. I think the priorities are wrong in this encyclical. He's very explicit about this. People who are contributing to the problem are sinners. Well, what judgment does that involve in terms of the people of China and India, who are simply saying that they want to claim the right to develop a middle-class society? I mean, I don't understand how these things can be reconciled.
Well, in fact, there is quite an apocalyptic tone, I think you say, Peter, in which churches are well used to notions of apocalypse. Is that something that bothers you, or do you think it's appropriate?
Well, it does bother me, because I think the language of apocalypticism or catastrophe...
do you think he's a bit of a catastrophist?
I think so. I think there are strong strains of catastrophism, as it were, in the encyclical, which worry me. And I think that he does talk about the world as if it's going to hell in a handbasket, which I don't think it is. And I think the suspicion of markets is an interesting point, because he does talk about the market as if it was some sort of invisible foe set against humankind.
Going back to this apocalypticism, I mean, I'd simply say that apocalypticism is a component part of Christian theology. I mean, the expectation of the coming of the Lord is a basic component part of Christian theology. So let's not pretend that he's Joachim of Fiore or, some crank. He isn't.
But he doesn't talk about population in that, Paul.
Well,
why doesn't he bring that up?
Well, he's got to tackle that. And the Catholic Church has to tackle it. I think the reason why he doesn't is quite simple. I think that it's actually political, and that is that it's to do with the Philippines bishops who have been fighting their government over reproductive health. The term that he uses in a derogatory tone is reproductive health. And I think one of the things we've got to understand here is Francis doesn't get it about women. He's an Argentinian male. And he doesn't understand that, he doesn't understand those kind of fertility, health issues that are embedded there. I think that's where the real even more than population, that's where the real problem is.
Yes, I mean, he has identified excessive materialism and consumption as a major issue of our time, and he really decries it. Now, Paul, there might be a lot of people who might say, yes, well, I think he's got it right there. We've lost our bearings a bit about consumption. And we will give him the time of day on that.
Well, look, there is greed in the world. There are excesses in the world. We did have a global financial crisis based on multiple abuses in the financial system, based on lack of regulation, based on personal foibles and greed. There's no question about any of that. What my concern is where he goes from that. And this goes to the question of a proper functioning economy. A proper functioning economy and a decent society go together. All we get is the talk about greed and excess. Now, I know that's a problem, but the question is, where does the Pope go after identifying the problem? And it seems to me that he goes to a very uncertain place.
Eleni, what do you think? That's a strong argument for a responsible involvement by the Church in a thriving modern economy. What's the matter with that?
There's nothing the matter with that. I think the Church has to be involved in a thriving economy. But how do we understand the economy? What is the aim of the economy? And I think what the Church has to offer, and certainly what we in the Uniting Church are trying to, and the World Council of Churches is trying to as well, is to offer a vision of an economy that's based around values such as equity, compassion, generosity and hospitality, to counter the values of greed, individualism and materialism. I'm getting a bit tired, personally, of always being referred to as a consumer and being told that we have to do things for the economy. I would rather that we do things for the society, to be frank.
The Anglican Church is urging its 70 million followers to take up the climate change fight, to fast and pray ahead of the UN climate change talks in Paris to succeed. Do you think that, again, with the overt involvement of churches, it is going to change the shape of debate around this issue?
I think it will. I think it will energise a lot of the Church. Many people will see it as inspiring. So in that sense, I think it's both popular and populist. I can see the strategy, but my admiration for those aspects of the document is overwhelmed by my concerns that I've outlined on this program.
That he's gone quasi-Marxist. Eleni, how do you see the possible changes to the political debate?
What I hope that this might take us to is in a sense, the depoliticisation of the climate change debate and a talk about the politics of climate change generally. So I'm not...
you mean a broader discussion? Gosh,
yes,
you're asking a lot.
I am asking a lot, but I have hope, and I'm spurred on in this hope by the document and by this conversation.
Peter, have you got any thoughts about whether you think it will change?
I think the debate will undoubtedly change, and in fact, if it does, the Pope will have fulfilled one of his objectives, because he does say specifically in the encyclical he wants to foster debate, and he recognises the limited capacity of the Church to talk about politics and science. People are talking about it, conversation is being generated, and it will continue to be generated, and I think that's a good thing.
I think that actually this conversation has succeeded in doing what he wants. That is, we have people with differing views and we're talking to each other in a civilised way, and we can recognise the arguments that people bring to it. The Anglicans and the Uniting Church have a good tradition of disagreement, and you do it very well. But we Catholics are just learning it.
Well, look, let me go to our viewer question, just as we sort of wind towards the end, which comes from Jennifer from Gisborne in Victoria. Church attendance has been declining over previous decades. Could the championing of causes related to climate change and environmental damage be a way for the Church to regain the relevancy it has lost in recent times? Paul?
I think the simple answer is no, because the reason why the Church's membership is declining really is a much bigger cultural issue. The Catholic Church in Australia is still struggling to get respect because of our abominable history, but recent history, not the past. What I think he's done is he's got something on the agenda and people are talking about it.
Paul, how do you see it?
I think there's a crisis, in a sense, between the role of the Church in the modern world and the Church looking relevant to people's lives. All the sexual abuse issues have destroyed, to a great extent, the moral standing of the Church. And I think it's going to be a long, long, hard road back.
Eleni?
Geraldine, we haven't seen any spikes in church attendance whenever we've spoken out on climate change issues.
Is that right?
So I agree with what Paul has said. We get many requests to work together with environmental groups to take action and to encourage our church members to be active. And it's often couched in terms of we need the church speaking out on this because you have a moral authority, you have a moral voice. My response to them is always, but you do too. It's just different. They go, yes, but we need you. So there's something very odd happening here, and I'm fascinated by it, and I'm trying to understand it, and I don't think I've got there yet.
Peter.
I think that whilst the debate about climate change is not going to transform the church, I think church leaders, Anglican church leaders, are concerned about appearing to be relevant and connected. And I think that the issue of climate change does afford the Anglican leadership an opportunity to show that they are engaged with issues that are of concern to the wider community. And it, I think, offers a new way of, or rather allows for a reworking of themes of ecology and environment that run through the gospel and allow those to be re-engaged in a new and perhaps revitalised way.
OK, well, we'll see. I think to be prompted to think what kind of world do we want to leave to the next generation is not a bad old question, is it, to ponder on. So I'd like to thank you all very much indeed. Paul Collins, Peter Curti, Eleni Poulos and Paul Kelly, thank you very much indeed for joining us.
Thank you.
And we do hope you'll join us again for our